we want to end up and how we get there is a bit of that journey. That if we do these kinds of reforms in education and these kinds of reforms in liberties and freedoms and women's rights and minority rights, then we would build this up to get to a country that we would like to see in 2047. That's a good way of looking at it. But there's another way of looking at Pakistan, and that is to imagine a Pakistan in 2447. It is almost akin to taking a position in the history of future, imagining the future, and in that future imagining an ideal country, which has all the components that were spoken about, and then some more. And then ask ourselves a different question. Not what we can do, but what would it take? And I promise you, if you ask these two questions, you would get starkly different answers. When you say, what can I do? It's almost like being constrained by your resources, by your human capital, by your geography. It's like being in prison, being chained, and asking yourself that, given that I have a weak arm, and I've been trashed, and I'm chained, where can I go? Where can I put my next step? And that's a reasonable way of looking at Pakistan and building it up from ground up. But you can also say, what would it take? What would it take to build a country? Some aspects of which have been described, and some aspects of which I leave to your imagination. Because after all, who's been able to look into the future? Who's been able to know what it carries for you? And this conference is all about imagineering. So without imagination, you would not be able to develop the contours of a country called Pakistan 2047. And at best we'd be able to say we'd have better education, we'd have better rights, we'd have better this, we'll have better that, perhaps better freedoms, and then continue to build up on it. When I would be amiss after the Air Marshal mentioning Star Trek, because that's my favorite story, not to share it since you mentioned. I was fascinated when I was growing up with this program called Star Trek, the first one, Spock and Captain Kirk and all of those characters. It predates most of you. But I remember that we used to go there and we'd be fascinated. Space, the ultimate frontier. And God knows where no man would dare to go, or things like that. And while we were still watching Star Trek second season or third season, all of those things that were in Star Trek, they became reality. That's the power of Imagineering, or the power of imagination. That is the power of future walking backwards rather than the present walking forwards. And that little transponder, while Star Trek was still on, became the first generation of cell phones. And it's impossible for me to tell my kids or convince them that there was a time when there were no cell phones. Try telling it to your kids, especially if they're 17, 18-year-olds, and mine are 20, 21, and 16-year-olds. It's impossible. I mean, I tell them and they don't believe me that there was a world in which there were no cell phones. And I remember people not having phones. I remember, aunties from the neighborhood coming to one's house because you had a phone. And people would call and say, कि जी आपकी call आ रही है, थोड़ी देर में phone करेंगे, neighborhood से बुला दे. This auntie would come stumbling for that phone, कि मेरा phone आ रहा है. And it was fantastic. And you see how fast the world has changed. It was just the power of imagination. And I remember as a kid asking myself, how could there be a phone if there's no wire? What would happen? There's no wire, so how does it go? And where would it go? and then it went all over. Now when I walk into the room, my nephew, my children, they're playing very crazy, very violent games with kids in Denmark. How do you even connect? I didn't even know where Denmark was. And how did you connect with these kids in Denmark? And what are you guys talking about with these little headphones and, yeah, kill him. How did all this, he's behind you. How did all this happen? It's all part of imagination. And that's what we need to celebrate the most. And if you remember that little food generator, where they would go and press a button and coffee would come out, that became microwave. And space, the ultimate frontier. Now for $1 million you can take space tours, actual commercial space tours. I mean, there are people who fund campaigns by more than $1 million. So people in Pakistan, many people in Pakistan, can now take commercial and visits to space for fun, for vacation, for the heck of it, just for going up in the air. So much for the frontiers. So all of these frontiers crumble in the wake of imagination. As we imagine and as we articulate, we continue to break these barriers of possible, not possible. What is that Shaw's little phrase that people look at things the way they are and ask, why? I imagine what is not and ask, why not? And I think that basically are the two different ways, and I have quoted it wrong, but that's what it was about. But that's how it works out. And it was just, I believe, in 1895 when Lord Kelvin said, how can something heavier than the air ever take off? And this is for the Air Marshal who was just telling you what he's been able to do and people who've gone into the space. Just 100 years ago, people couldn't imagine something that is heavier than air, how can it fly? And this was the leading physicist and the mathematician in the United Kingdom at that time. And just in, I believe, 1947, I believe Thomas Watson said, there's probably a market of 5 computers in this world. And how many now you count on a table? And then I think Digital, the largest computer company, they in 1977 said that, there is no need for individuals to have computers. No need for individuals to have computers. I can't even take notes. I carry this little thing. I was sitting there fumbling, dropping pen and then coffee and then water bottles because I was trying to take down notes for this conference. And it's all, so future is anything but a linear projection of the present. If there is anything we know in this room is that what is absolutely, what you can be certain about is discontinuity. So preparing for that discontinuity, I believe, is where I would leave. We try to leave Pakistan in 24/7. And what kind of discontinuities can come about? There's so many of them. Some of them have been mentioned. But I think the contours of the future would be defined by 4 key things that are happening right now. I think the future would be defined by nanotechnology. I think this whole journey of building atom up to material, and a material which has zero waste, and a material which has, which miniaturizes everything, that I think is going to be a fantastic future. And I'm talking about 2047, I'm not going farther down. These are the things that are actually going to happen because you've already begun to see 3D printing. There's no rocket science there. I think the future is also going to be defined by biotechnology. I think at some point in time, as I always say, jokingly perhaps, that death would be looked upon as an illness. Because we've decoded the genome, we know what this is all about. We're already creating organs in our petri dishes. If we're already creating organs in the petri dishes, how long would it take for us to erect these organs again? We're already taking undifferentiated cells and we are programming them to become the liver and the heart and this and that. We haven't gotten into the complexity of brain, but all of these things are happening. The little tapeworm is already living 7 times its natural age in the lab. So why would your children not live for 200 or 300 years? It's beyond me. The rate at which technology commercializes, the rate at which technology has commercialized, I ponder, I ask myself, why would it not happen? It won't happen to me. It probably wouldn't happen to you or some of you. But why wouldn't it happen to your grandchildren? I mean, things that